Society Matters.
Hello, and thank you for joining me today. I'm your host, Richard Acritelli. This podcast is a production of the Holocaust Memorial and Tolerance Center of Nassau County. On today's episode of The Fog of War and Humanity, here on hmTV, my special guest is Kwan Mai Pham. We'll discuss her book, A Bridge from Saigon, and we have an unbelievable guest today, unbelievable experiences that will really, really enlighten this program. So, Mai, let's get started. What can you tell me about your final moments in South Vietnam before coming to this country?
Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me, Rich. It's actually a real honor to have Vietnam vets in the audience, so I appreciate that. In Bridge from Saigon, I describe a very vivid memory I have of not boarding the cargo flight that we were on, but being in the hull of it and realizing that I was the only one standing up at age 7. Everyone else was lying down. I didn't know what was happening. And I felt my grandmother pulling me down to the floor, and I watched the hatch as it closed slowly. And that was my last memory of Saigon at dawn.
What date was that there? Do you remember?
In April 20th. We left 10 days before the fall of Saigon.
And that was 1975?
1975, yep.
So I was born April 11th. So you have literally a couple of years on me, right? And we both look great for our ages, right? And but there's certain things in a lifetime you never forget, and I'm sure you never forget that moment itself.
Yeah, and there's so many things that happen to you in your life that connect in unexpected ways. And one of the ways that happened for me was that as an adult, when I was getting ready to go back to Vietnam as an adult, I decided I was finally ready to read books about the war. I hadn't up until that point. It was just like emotionally too stressful to think about that. And I didn't want to read the books that were written from the perspective of like a journalist or a politician. I wanted to read something written by someone who really understood Vietnam. And the book I found was Understanding Vietnam, written by Neil Jameson. I don't know if you know him, but he was an American anthropologist, and he had actually lived and worked in Vietnam for years before American military intervention. And so he spoke the language and he really understood the culture.
So he was there, 50s, early 60s, right?
Yeah, he was there, I think, at least from the early 60s, if not before. Anyway, I was so taken by the book that I wrote him a letter. His wife responded because he was in Vietnam at the time, and we all became friends. And then she told me that he was on the tarmac the day I took off in Vietnam because he was part of the Black Ops operation, helping refugees get out.
And I'm sure he left right around that time, I would imagine, right?
I suspect he stayed till near the end. Yeah.
And he could have been one of the last ones out of there.
Yes, but he's been back to Vietnam many times since then. He's passed now.
Okay.
Yeah.
But he's somebody that you just have a vivid memory of, right? Of his work and his story, and you certainly made a connection with him.
Yeah, it was really deeply meaningful to listen to his stories, because he just had so much empathy for everyone, for the soldiers, for the officers, for the locals. He really could see it from all sides. And I think it was one of the things that drew me to him, because, of course, that's part of my experience too. As a first generation immigrant, it's why the book is titled that way. It's because you're constantly bridging in between worlds.
Sure. Now, your first 7 years are in South Vietnam, right? What are some of the recollections of being a young girl in South Vietnam during the war? What are things that you recall?
So I think that I was very privileged. I don't think we weren't extremely wealthy, but we were middle class. My parents had professional jobs. My dad was a college professor and also worked part-time as a translator for the US Army. And my mom worked for AID. And I think she became like the highest paid local civilian employee at AID. So I think my parents protected us a lot. They shielded us from many, many things. No one explained to me that there was a war happening. I would hear helicopters overhead, and I might run into a soldier, walking down an alley, but I didn't understand really what was happening.
You were born 1968, if I got the math right.
That's right.
At the height of TED, where while there was a TED every year, that was the strongest one. And
that's my origin story. Is like, I was actually born at the end of May, but on the morning of Tet was when my father chose my name, and then that was the first day of the Tet offensive.
Now, where were you born? Was it in Saigon?
Yeah, it was in Saigon, in the same hospital where my mom birthed all her babies. When I went back to Vietnam in the late 90s, and I finally managed to convince my parents to come visit me, because, my dad was very, very, I think, psychologically stressed about doing that. But they came and they showed me things I didn't remember. Like, they took me to the hospital. It was the Catholic hospital, and it was still there. And she pointed to the room where she gave birth to me. And we went to the zoo where they had some of their secret dates away from my grandmother. And we even found my elementary school. And it turned out the same headmistress was still there, and she recognized me.
I tell my students in school, as high school students, a lot of you guys are going to go to college, you're going to go upstate, you're going to go elsewhere in the country, right? And you may stay there. The jobs might be there, you might like it there, you might meet somebody, but you're always going to come back to where you grew up at some point in your life. And you had the opportunity to do that many decades later. And when you look at Saigon, do you recognize it still as Saigon or as Ho Chi Minh City?
When my husband and I lived there for a year in like 98, 99.
So you did live over there then?
Yeah, we lived there and we worked there for a whole year. I very much thought of it as Saigon because it was still in transition. There was clearly like economic development going on, but we lived downtown in the old French Quarter, and the streets felt very familiar to me from when I was little. Now, though, I mean, we went back in 2016, and I would say already then it felt very different. It was in part because so much development had happened. I mean, there's skyscrapers now, and the traffic is completely overwhelming. But I also felt like people were more set in their ways. The Saigon that I remember and the Saigon of history was, and I'm curious about whether you or your audience would agree with this. I always thought of it as like some mix of the Wild Wild West and Texas and Manhattan, kind of all rolled into one. It's
sure.
Like this, pirates and marauders.
You had a major city there. You had the Vietnamese culture. You had the French culture. then you have other countries coming in and out, and then you have the United States that's there, let's say, from 63 to 73 with the war. You have a lot of different influences in there, right? And different ways of looking at things, right? And so the Wild West is a good way of putting it, right?
West, really spunky. Like the laws are a little sketchy. And there's always this negotiation, even when we were there, even though obviously it was communist, things happened there that wouldn't have been allowed to happen anywhere else in Vietnam. There was a condom sculpture contest to promote HIV prevention. That kind of stuff would not happen in, say, Hanoi. But when we went back in 2016, it felt different. It felt very grown up, very buttoned down a little bit. And I wasn't sure if that same kind of like freewheeling spirit was still there. We didn't stay long enough to figure that out, but that's one of the things that I'm curious about.
Well, the irony is, right? America fights the war over there. We lose 59,000 soldiers. It's a very tough time on this country, right? The veterans have a hard time with the war afterwards. The country doesn't like talking about it for a long time, right? But the relations between us and the Vietnamese now is very strong. Like we'll give them some military aid and finance because we know they're not fans of the Chinese, right? And the relations are actually pretty good. And then when you go over there in the 1990s, that's when Clinton pretty much opened up Vietnam back to American trade. So you kind of saw it early on progress, right? From it being almost non-existent to being opened up, right? And, both sides kind of test the waters a little bit. And today it's a strong economy. It really, and I'm sure over the years, more education and more know-how and everything else that you've seen develop. I would imagine so.
Vietnamese really love Americans. There's especially South Vietnamese, and I don't think that's driven by politics. I really think it's driven by like this affinity that South Vietnamese have for new things. Or they're just a very open, friendly people, and they want to make those connections. And that's a much more American vibe than, say, a Russian vibe, right? Or a Chinese vibe. If there's one culture that Vietnamese really, really hate, it's Chinese.
They don't do well. They don't do well with them. And, you're looking at the Filipinos, the Vietnamese, the Japanese, the South Koreans. They're all very concerned about the strength of Chinese expansion, and
it comes from having survived centuries of Chinese invasions over and over again. One of the things I learned when we were there was that, the Chinese, whenever they invaded, they would try to wipe out Vietnamese history. They literally burn history books. And so the Vietnamese just got used to passing on all of that history through oral traditions and then writing it down as soon as they pushed the Chinese out. And then the whole cycle would start over again. The Chinese, the Vietnamese don't have any kind of experience like that with the Americans. Like the American War was, from their perspective, just a blink of an eye in their history.
So now you come over here, right? Where's the first place that you land within the United States?
We landed in the West Mount Airy neighborhood of Philadelphia in middle of May, 1975. We were the first Vietnamese refugee family there.
Wow. Now, were you able to, because your family is very well educated, right? Your dad was a professor. What did he teach?
He, in Vietnam, he taught literature, and he also had a side gig writing kind of instructional books about um, educational psychology and how to take standardized exams, which were a very new thing in Vietnam. When we came to the US, he got a job pretty quickly as a public school teacher. And then he was a school teacher his whole life.
Where was that? Was that in Philadelphia or outside of Philly?
Yeah, it was in Philly, and he taught at a couple of schools, but where he spent most of his time was at South Philadelphia High School, which at the time was like had the highest concentration of refugee students, and that was
And that's from Vietnam?
it was started from Vietnam, but then you got Cambodia, right?
Sure.
And you got kids from the Philippines, and it was kind of from all over. And if you, I don't know how familiar you are with Vietnamese American communities, but to be a teacher is kind of like to also be the priest and the social worker and the family lawyer, right? You kind of help in every which way. They come to you for all those things.
Very highly respected, right? With the education and kind of where they were in their part of society. My best friend's Indian. He's a Sikh. And they came over here and lived the American dream. And his dad was a principal over there. And, in the Punjab area. And it was one of those things. He was very highly respected, figure, and
teachers are really sacred to Vietnamese. But, one of the things that I grew up being a part of was my dad helping all these new families when they arrived. So I have memories of helping him to pack like household items and use clothes and things into boxes. And then we'd drive down to South Philly and we'd help hand them out. I know that he helped a whole bunch of families with their legal paperwork. He would tutor after school and at night. He would translate for them. It was his whole life.
It had to help that he comes here, right? Philadelphia is very different than Saigon, right? Obviously, right? It's cultural differences, right? But he was a pretty worldly figure, right? In terms of his education, his background, he was very, very well spoken for. And does that help you with your own assimilation? Like for a while, you're a stranger in a strange land, right? Right? Does that help you a little bit with your assimilation into this country?
There is no doubt that my parents, having been so well educated, and my dad actually, before I was born, he had come to Philly and he studied at Penn for his master's degree in child psychology. So he knew the city a little bit already. No question that it helped in terms of their getting jobs quickly.
So he comes here and then he goes back. So he comes here for his education, then he goes back to South Vietnam. Wow, that's, you don't know what curveballs it's going to throw at you, right? And obviously your family gets out of South Vietnam, but the fact that he has that background in this country, that's got to be a huge help.
Yes, and he wasn't alone because his roommate when he was at Penn was a young law student named Dan Ross. And then Dan got called up for duty and got stationed in Saigon. So we have pictures of Dan at our house in Saigon in the early 70s. And then when we were able to get out
was he military?
He was military, yeah.
Wow.
I don't think he wasn't in infantry. I think he was like with the quartermaster.
Sure.
But when we when we got on the cargo flight, my dad had sent a telegram to Dan asking if he would sponsor us. But we left before we got his response. So it was just sort of like a leap of faith. Got on the flight, got to Manila, got to Guam, got to Fort Chaffee. And it wasn't until we got to Fort Chaffee that Dan managed to get a message through saying, of course we would sponsor you.
Was that Arkansas, Fort Chaffee?
Yeah.
How long did you stay there for?
It couldn't have been very long, right? Because we left April 20th and we got to Philadelphia like a month later.
Okay.
So it couldn't have been more than like a week or two. It felt longer. But the Rosses were just...
You were smack dab in middle in America there. I mean, that's...
We're Midwestern raised and in West Philly, solid Methodists, and they were just so generous and lovely. And that was, I think that really helped too, because they helped to settle my brothers into school, my older brothers into school. They got childcare for my baby brother. They helped my...
How many, it's you, your parents, and then how many other siblings and family members? So 3 brothers. Did you have any aunts or uncles or cousins that were able to get on the plane with you guys?
Yes. So we left with all of my mother's siblings and their children and my grandmother. But we were the only ones who ended up in Philadelphia. The others ended up in Maryland and New Jersey and Florida and Texas for different reasons.
So you did have some family near you in terms of Maryland, right?
Yeah, near enough to have reunions like once a year, but not near enough for me to, as a 7-year-old, really feel like I could reach out to them. Because, this was before cell phones.
Yeah, there's no LOLs, right?
8-year-olds didn't get on the phone and talk to people, especially when you're dealing with so much change and turmoil.
Now, let me ask you this. You come to this country, you're 7 years old. You're probably in 2nd grade, maybe, would be the equivalent maybe today, right? Did you know any English at all? Did your parents teach you any English when you were younger?
I knew 2 phrases in English when I was in Saigon, because education there was trilingual, English, French, and Vietnamese. But then we got here and...
Do you remember those 2 phrases?
No. But I'm told I was really bossy, and I'd sit at the front door and not let anybody pass until they spoke to me in English and French.
All right.
I think I'm still bossy. But so we landed in Philadelphia, and there was still 2 weeks of 1st grade left. So my father took me to this elementary school. I was the first Asian kid there ever. And then he left me, and I don't remember anyone explaining to me what was happening. And so I just freaked out, and I just started sobbing and crying right there. And one of the teachers comforted me. So it was 2 weeks of that, and then summer vacation. And what happened during summer vacation was that every morning, my father or one of my older brothers would take me into the porch, and they would do English drills with me. And by the end of the summer, I had English fluent, no accent. And that's how I started 2nd grade, which, I talk about this in Bridge from Saigon, but the paradox was that being so good at learning the new language meant that my teachers wasn't sure I needed any help assimilating, because I didn't sound like it,
You were pretty quick in terms of picking it up, kids are sponges, right? But 3 languages, Vietnamese, your main language, then French, right? And then English. That's a lot for any kid. But I guess your father, he knew we're in this country. It's going to make it easier to assimilate, to communicate, education, and so on. And you have to fend for yourself too, because your parents aren't always going to be around you, right? And one thing, ESL in the mid-1970s was, there wasn't really much known about it still, right? People tried, but it's not like today, right? In terms of the different languages and breaking things down and so on. And, you were probably very fortunate. Your father had that hindsight all right, today we're going to learn alphabet. We're going to do this. We're going to do this phrase and so on. And that's very, very interesting. Your book is going to present that to people, and they're going to either look back and say, all right, I'm first generation now, or I remember when my family did this, or this is part of the American dream. So it really goes down a lot of different avenues, itself. It really does. It's pretty remarkable, your story. And we're just touching the iceberg here, right? We're just, you're still a kid that we're going over, and it's extremely, extremely interesting. All right, so we're going to end this episode right now, okay? We're going to come back for a second episode here on the Fog of War and Humanity on hmTV, and we're going to be taking a look at Mai's book, Bridge from Saigon, and we're going to definitely delve into it. Please come back for a second episode with us.